Hi everybody, welcome to another Storytime with Sid. It is me, Sidney of Hightower, of course, as it is every week, and I have a very interesting story for you today. So, recently I've been thinking a lot, and unfortunately the book of stories that I've been going through are getting pretty slim, and that's fine because I love the short stories, and I think that they're still, of course, incredibly important to tell, but I'm running out of stories. Now, I do have an amazing mortal friend, and she is willing to let me borrow her book of American folklore to read. And I think that's equally as fascinating because I'm a mortal studies major after all, and I have plenty of folklore to read. It doesn't just have to be fairy tales. It can be actual, from different parts of the country or even the world. So that makes me very excited. So I just wanted to let you guys know that, just in case, you turn on this channel one day and you're like, wait, that takes place in America? What's America? And if you don't know what America is, I will be sure to tell you. Okay, but in the meantime, let's get to this week's story. And this week's story is called The Bell. Gotta get ready. In the evening, the narrow streets of the big city, when the sun went down and the clouds shone like gold among the chimney tops, first one person, then another would often hear an odd sound, like the chiming of a church bell. But it was heard only for a moment, because there was a rumbling of wagons and such shouting, and that was quite distracting. Now the evening bell is ringing, people would say. Now the sun is going down. Those who were walked outside the city, where the houses stood far apart, where gardens and small fields, saw even more splendid evening sky and heard the bell chime much louder. The sound seemed to come from a church, deep inside the silent, fragrant forest, and people would look at the direction and grow quite solemn. Many years passed, and one person began saying to another, "I wonder if there's a church out there in the forest. That bell has a strange, lovely ring to it. Let's go and take a closer look." And the rich people drove while the poor people walked, but the road seemed exceptionally long. When they reached a grove of willow trees that grew along the edge of the forest, they sat down and looked at the long branches and thought they were truly out in nature. A pastry chef from the city went out and pitched his tent, and then another pastry chef came along and hung a bell right over his tent. But it was the kind of bell that had been tarred to withstand the rain, and the clapper was missing. When people returned home, they said it had been so romantic that went far beyond tea party chatter. 3 people claimed that they had gotten all the way to the forest to the other side, and they had heard the strange bell ringing the whole time. But it seemed to them that the sound was coming from the city. One of them wrote an entire ballad about it, and said that the bell rang like a mother's voice singing to a beloved child. No melody was lovelier than the chiming of the bell. The emperor of the country had also taken notice and promised that whoever could discover the sound it was coming from would win the title of World Bell Ringer, even if it turned out not to be a bell. Now many people went to the forest in the hope of acquiring that excellent position, but there was only one who came home with any sort of explanation. No one had gone far enough inside, not even this man, and yet he said that the bell sound came from an enormous owl inside a hollow tree. It was some kind of owl of wisdom who was constantly knocking its head against the tree, but whether the sound came from its head or from the hollow trunk, he couldn't say yet for certain. Then he was appointed World Bell Ringer, and each year he wrote a short dissertation about the owl, but no one was any the wiser. Then Confirmation Day came around, and the pastor spoke so beautifully and fervently. Those who were to be confirmed were very moved. It was an important day for them. They had suddenly grown from children into grown-ups. Their childish souls now seemed to pass into more sensible adults. The sunshine was at its loveliest. The children who had been confirmed walked out of the city and from the forest into the great unknown bell chimed, wondrous and loud. Wow. They suddenly had such a desire to go into the forest, all but 3 of them. The first had to go home to try on their ball gown because that gown and that ball was the reason she had been confirmed right now anyway, otherwise she would have been invited. The second was a poor boy who had borrowed his confirmation jacket and boots from the landlord's son, and they had to be returned at a certain time. The third said that he didn't go to strange places unless his parents went along, and he had always been a well-behaved child. That's what he would continue to be now after being confirmed, and there was no need to make fun of him. But they did. Children. So 3 of them stayed behind and the others set off. The sun shone and the birds sang, and the children sang too, holding each other's hands, because they had not yet found work and were all newly confirmed for our Lord. But soon 2 of the youngest grew tired and headed back to the city. 2 girls sat down to make wreaths, so they didn't go along either. When the rest reached the willow trees and the pastry chef's tent, they said, "Look! Here we are! The bell doesn't exist at all. It's just something people have imagined." At that very moment, from deep in the forest, the bell rang so sweetly and solemnly that 4 of the 5 children decided to go farther into the forest. It was so dense, so laden with leaves that it was quite difficult to make any headway. Woodruff and windflower seemed to grow much too high. Flowering morning glory and blackberry vines hung in long garlands from tree to tree where the nightingales sang and rays of sun played. Oh, it was so blissful. But there was no pathway for the girls to follow. Their clothes would have been torn to shreds. There were huge boulders covered with moss in all different colors. Fresh spring water was trickling out and saying quite strangely, "Glug, glug." "That couldn't be the bell, could it?" said one of the boys as he laid down to listen. "We're going to have to study this." Then he stayed behind and let the others continue on. They came to a house made of bark and branches. A huge tree with wild apples was bending over it, as if to shake all its blessings onto the roof, which was covered with rose blossoms. The long branches wound around the whole gable, and from the gable hung a little bell. Could that be the one they had heard? Yes, they all thought it was, except for one boy. He said the bell was too small and delicate to be heard as far away as they had heard it, and that its tones were quite different from those that could move a human heart. The boy who spoke was a king's son, and so the others said, "Someone like that always wants to seem more clever." Then they let him continue on alone, and as he walked, his chest became more and more filled with forest loneliness. But he could still hear the little bell that pleased the others, and sometimes when the wind came from the direction of the pastry tent, he could also hear people singing as they drank tea. But in the deep petals of the bell grew even louder. It soon sounded as if an organ were playing along. The sound came from the left, from the side of the heart. Then there was a rustling in the thicket, and a little boy stood in front of the king's son. A boy wearing wooden clogs and a jacket so short it was quite clear what long wrists he had. They recognized each other. He was the boy who couldn't come along because he had to go home and return his jacket and the boots to the landlord's son. That's what he had done, and then, wearing wooden clogs and his own ragged clothes, he had set off alone, because the ringing of the bell was so loud and so deep he had to find it. "We could go together," said the king's son, but the poor boy with the wooden clogs was quite bashful. He tugged at the short sleeves of his jacket and said he was afraid he wouldn't be able to walk fast enough, and besides, he thought they should look for the bell on the right because that's where everything grand and glorious can be found. "Well, then our paths won't cross," said the king's son, and nodded to the poor boy who headed into the darkest and thickest part of the forest, where the thorns tore his poor clothes to shreds and bloodied his face, hands, and feet. The king's son also had a few deep scratches, but the sun shone on his path, and he's the one we're going to follow, because he was a spirited lad. "I will and I must find that bell," he said, "even if I have to go to the ends of the earth." Horrid monkeys sat high in the trees, gaping with all their teeth bared. "Should we pelt him?" they said. He is the king's son." But he walked undisturbed deeper and deeper into the forest, where the most wondrous flowers grew. There were white paradise lilies with blood-red filaments, sky-blue tulips that flashed in the wind, and apple trees with apples that looked exactly like huge, shimmering soap bubbles. Just imagine how those trees shone in the sunlight. Stags and does played in the grass and in the loveliest green meadows where magnificent oaks and beech trees grew. If one of the trees had split in the bark, grass and long vines grew from the crevice. There were also enormous stretches of forest with quiet lakes where the white swans swam and flapped their wings. The king's son often stopped to listen, and many times he thought that the ringing of the bell was coming from him to one of these trees in the deep lakes. But then he realized it wasn't coming from there at all. It was from even deeper in the forest that the bell was ringing. Then the sun began to set. The air blazed red like fire. It grew so quiet inside the forest. He sank to his knees, sang his evening hymn, and said, "Will I ever find what I'm looking for? Now the sun is setting. Now night is coming, dark night. Yet maybe I could see the round red sun one more time before it sinks completely behind the earth. I'll climb up to the rocks over there. They're all as high as the tallest trees." He grabbed a hold of vines and roots, climbing the wet rocks where the water snakes were coiled, where the toads seemed to be barking at him. But he reached the top before the sun had set completely. Seen from that height, oh, it was a splendor. That sea, the great glorious sea, tumbled its long waves against the shore and stretched out before him, with the sun floating like a great gleaming altar out where the sea and sky met. Everything merged into blazing colors. The forest sang, and the sea sang, and his heart sang too. All of nature was one great holy cathedral in which the trees and drifting clouds were the pillars, the flowers and grass were the woven velvet cloth, and the sky itself an enormous dome. Up there, the red colors were extinguished and the sun vanished. But millions of stars were lit, millions of diamond lamps glittered, and the king's son spread out his arms towards the sky, towards the sea and the forest. At that moment, from the aisle on the right, appeared the poor boy with the short sleeves and the wooden clogs. He had arrived at the same time, taking his own path. The two boys ran to each other and held hands in the great cathedral of nature and poetry. Above them rang the invisible sacred bell, and blessed spirits hovered and danced around them to a jubilant hallelujah. And that was the bell. I loved that story. I love that so much. It's been a while since we've had a very nice ending, hasn't it? No, the reason I love that story so much is because nature is such a beautiful thing. And in modern day society, it's something that humans haven't necessarily been in contact with in a while. At least not most of them. But there is something so effortlessly beautiful about the beauty of nature and the silence and the peace. And when you go out into nature alone or with a friend, you have the most clear thoughts, because there's no distractions, no technology for you to look at, just the grass and the trees and the sky and the stars. And it's beautiful. It's something in the Fae realm that I miss very much, for we have lots of nature and brilliant, beautiful places to explore. You have that in the mortal realm too. But it takes a very special person to find the most undiscovered places. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys are staying happy, healthy, and safe, and I will see you next week. Thank you so much, guys.